Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're going to be presenting on why am I being asked about SSAE 16 and what do I need to know to talk intelligently. I first want to introduce the Printing Industries Association of San Diego. The Printing Industries Association of San Diego is a nonprofit trade association of over 200 member companies organized to provide support to the graphic arts industry in San Diego through education and information. PIASD offers programs designed to assist owners and management of graphic arts firms in the effective and profitable conduct of their business. PIASD works cooperatively with a number of other groups and is part of the statewide organization of Printing Industries of California. PIASD is an affiliate of Printing Industries of America, which is the largest printing trade association in the world. I would next like to welcome our speaker, Todd Stevenson. Todd is the Vice President at Kirkpatrick Price. He's an Information Security and Compliance Specialist and holds the Certified Information Systems Auditor certification. He has spent the last 7 years helping organizations comply with the requirements of SSAE 16, SOC 2, PCI, FSMA, ISO, HIPAA, and most recently, requirements being enforced by the CFPB. Before I hand it over to Todd, I just want to let everyone know that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, to please submit those using the Q&A feature that's located on your WebEx toolbar. Todd?
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so KP is a licensed CPA firm, and so we specialize in third-party attestation and audits, particularly for information security. So we work with over 300 clients. We're in our 11th year now and specialize in the kind of audits that we're talking about today. So we've helped a lot of clients in the printing industry in particular prepare for these audits, number one, but also to successfully complete them. So I'm going to share some of our experience and background in this area, and hopefully it will be helpful for the audience today. So thank you all for joining us. So just a little bit about the specifics of what we do, so that if you have any questions after the webinar, I'd be happy to answer them, primarily about these areas. We do work with firms on the readiness side, so we can help you develop the policies and procedures and that sort of thing to prepare for some of these audits, and then we perform the SSAE 16, the SOC 2, PCI, FSMA, HIPAA, as well as ISO. I know we're going to be talking a lot about HIPAA auditing today. That didn't make the list on the slide, but certainly something we do a lot of. So that's just a little bit about us. So let me go ahead and kind of jump into the topic today. One of my main goal today is to help you understand, what is SSAE 16 in the first place, primarily, and what is HIPAA compliant mean? Why are my clients asking me for that? And hopefully help you have some background to be able to talk with them intelligently, as well as have enough information to determine if that's something as an organization you want to pursue for your business as well. So it's definitely an alphabet soup. You hear SSAE 16, SOC 2, HIPAA, PCI, FSMA. It's always these alphabet acronyms, and it certainly does feel like alphabet soup. And so, of course, this is all I deal with, so they all make sense to me, but I get calls every day asking what do these things mean. So I just want to share some of that information with you and help you to make sense of that. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So let me talk about what drives the question in the first place. Why is my client calling me and asking me about one of these things? So ultimately, most of what you're being asked for is driven by a federal law. So in 1996, the HIPAA legislation was passed, which mandates the protection of protected health information, known as PHI. In 1999, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which regulates banking and requires financial institutions to protect PII, the personally identifiable information, and so they have to have adequate internal controls to protect that data. In the case of HIPAA, it's appropriate physical, administrative, and technical safeguards, but again, ultimately controls that will protect the specific data. Sarbanes-Oxley focused on the public companies and required them to ensure that their financial statements were accurate. Again, because it's a public company and stock is owned by the public, they want to ensure that those financial statements are accurate. So again, Sarbanes-Oxley requires publicly traded companies in this case to have adequate internal control over financial reporting and the systems that support financial reporting. So and then moving on, there's a couple other things that are relevant here. One is FSMA. So in 2002, the Federal Information Security Management Act was enacted, which requires the federal government to have adequate control in place to protect federal data. So, and in 2004, and this one stands out a little uniquely from the others in that it's not a law, it's not legislatively driven. This was privately driven, but the credit card brands, the Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express primarily, got together and created a data security standard to protect credit card data, in this case to protect their bottom line. As you know, most credit card brands do pay for fraud, so you have fraud protection if there's fraud that's paid for by the credit card system and not the cardholder. So there's a high amount of financial reason to protect that data. So that's pushed down contractually, meaning the bank, the issuer that issues the bank card is contractually obligated to enforce the standard and is subject to fine and penalty. The bank then contracts the merchant who's taking the credit card transaction. They contractually agree to be compliant with the standard with financial obligation, et cetera. So that requirement's actually pushed down contractually. So the key thing, though, that all of them have in common is that they all require those organizations. So in our list, we're talking about financial institutions, healthcare entities, we're talking about publicly traded companies, those who work with the federal government, and anyone who's managing credit card data. Any of those companies, all of those standards require those entities to also ensure that any service provider that they use that has access to that data, that the service provider also meets those standards. So those companies, your clients in this case, the financial institution, for instance, the credit union that's sending statement data to you so that you can print statements for them, for instance, is federally mandated to ensure that you have the appropriate internal controls to protect that data. And so they have two ways to meet that requirement. They can either do that audit themselves, meaning they validate your controls, they send someone out and do an audit, they read your documentation, your policies, procedures, et cetera. And if you work with banks and you may have received questionnaires, they may have visited your facility, that sort of thing. It's either that approach or they need to have an appropriate third-party audit performed. And the appropriate third-party audit of the service provider will allow them to meet their legal requirement. So the question then becomes, what's appropriate? Well, when Sarbanes-Oxley and GLBA in particular were enacted, that was the question to the legislators. What is an appropriate audit? And the answer at the time that was given was SAS 70. SAS 70 was an appropriate audit format for that. So that set the stage for SSAE 16 because SAS 70 was used for years, a good decade, and then SAS 70 was replaced by SSAE 16 in 2011, and so the industry standardized on SSAE 16. So particularly if you're dealing with a financial institution or a publicly traded company, you're going to hear about SSAE 16. But ultimately, these audits, all 5 of the ones I've got on the slide here, are all designed to meet that appropriate requirement. And which audit format you use depends on who you're working with, because certain entities like certain audits. So let's kind of walk through that. So who would ask me for an SSAE 16? So like I mentioned, publicly traded companies are going to ask you for an SSAE 16 if they're sending you financial data. In particular, financial institutions are going to ask both traditional and non-traditional. So that would be a bank like a credit union, community bank, or national bank, but that would also be like brokerage houses or mortgage providers, anyone providing even non-traditional financial services. If you had a contract with, you know, a brokerage firm or something like that, then they would be subject to GLBA. State and local government. So state and local governments saw that the industry had standardized on SSAE 16, and they adopted that as well. So if you're getting an RFP from a state or local government, maybe a state agency or even a local county government, maybe for printing statements for property tax bills, for instance, you know, you will commonly see SSAE 16 on the RFP or RFI. And then most common means of it is the most common means of attestation for service providers in the U.S. It is the most commonly asked. So you that's kind of the largest umbrella, if you will. So SOC 2. So SOC 2 is interesting. It was created in 2011. So when SAS 70 was retired and SSAE 16 replaced SAS 70, the AICPA, the American Institute for Certified Public Accountants, also created the SOC 2 framework. It's an audit. It's very similar to SSAE 16, and so therefore very similar entities ask for it. It is most commonly asked for those that are providing technology services. So it is most commonly going to be asked for data centers, hosting providers, software providers, people that are providing technology services is its most common request. So HIPAA. Who would ask you to validate with an audit your compliance with HIPAA? And that would be any entity who handles protected health information. So it's going to be covered entities, the healthcare providers themselves, those providing health services, business associates, which would be those that service that industry, and then sub-service organizations of business associates as well. So if you think about it, it all flows downhill. So the covered entity, the healthcare provider, is required to meet the requirement, but they also have to validate that their service providers do. But the service providers are also required by law to validate their service providers, which could be you. So you as a printing organization could be printing statements for the healthcare organization. You could be working for a business associate who's a servicer of the healthcare industry, maybe a process server or a claims processing company, that sort of thing. A third-party administrator, for instance, is a business associate. Or you could even be working for a subservice organization of those, but if they handle PHI, protected health information, you may see that request. And again, it could be public or private company, it doesn't matter. So PCI. PCI is ultimately going to be driven by credit card data. So in the printing industry, just getting really practical, you probably don't do enough individual transactions yourself to be required to do a PCI audit as a merchant, meaning I'm using my client's credit card number for payment purposes to you. What would happen is if you're printing statements that require you to receive a credit card number from your client. So if you were printing credit card statements, for instance, that would certainly require a full PCI audit. But a lot of printing companies that we work with print marketing material for a variable data marketing printing, marketing material to be inserted in credit card statements. And so they have transactional data in order to be able to do the variable data printing. And so the financial institution would ask them, or the card brand, that sort of thing, bank would ask them to be audited by PCI. So FSMA, if you work with the federal government or someone who has a contract with the federal government, that would drive a FSMA audit. I'm not going to talk too much about that. It's not as common. We do have printers that are working in this space and do have a FSMA audit for that reason, but it's certainly a smaller number. So let me just talk a little bit about what is an SSAE 16, just so that you understand what it is. Now that you know who's asking for it and why. So in simple terms, an SSAE 16 is an audit of the internal controls you have, and when I say internal controls, think policies and procedures, the controls that you have in place to protect your client's data. So your client needs to know that you have they need to know you have adequate internal control because they're required to have adequate internal control. So the SSAE 16 is performed by a CPA. It has to be a CPA who's qualified and experienced in performing SSAE 16. The audit is relevant to your client's data. So this is a common question I get is, are you going to audit my financial statements? And the answer is no. SSAE 16 doesn't care about your financial data or your employees' data, for instance, how you protect the Social Security number of your employees. It's strictly concerned with how you protect your client's data. The key to SSAE 16 and why it's confusing if you Google SSAE 16, why you'll get all sorts of different information that doesn't make sense, is because there is not a set standard of requirements for SSAE 16. SSAE 16 is what we call risk-based. It's a risk-based audit. So you sit down as an organization and you first identify what are the risks to your client. A good example of a risk would be physical theft, right? My client sends me a variable data file. It's sitting in a server in my shop, and someone could break in at night and steal that server with the database on it. So that's a risk, physical theft. So I implement an objective. The objective is prevent unauthorized physical access to the facility. That's my objective. And then the control that I would put in place in this case would be locks on doors, perhaps video cameras, whatever, right? We would put some controls in place to prevent unauthorized access. So again, the SSAE 16 process is making a list of all of those risks and then putting the controls in place that would protect my client against those risks. So no two businesses have the same list. Therefore, no two SSAE 16s have the same set of requirements, but it's customized to your specific industry. So it is something that you typically will need an expert that can help you identify what are those things that should be in place and then provide the guidance necessary to put them in place so that you could then obviously successfully pass the audit. So that's essentially what an SSAE 16 is. If you think about it, the audit itself is really a container. It's a wrapper, and the inside requirements are customized. But the SSAE 16 tells us how we audit those things and what the rules are about the way we audit as a CPA. So what is this SSAE 16 most commonly used for? Well, it's most commonly used in this case for information security. So for the printing industry, SSAE 16 is most commonly used for a client to understand what are the operational, technical, administrative controls you have in place to protect, their data. It would also commonly be used for things that would involve processing integrity, meaning what are the quality controls you put in place to ensure accuracy, for instance, would be a common internal control reported on during an SSAE 16 for the printing industry. So any contractual requirements, if your client requires you to do an annual penetration test, for instance, those kinds of contractual requirements could be reported on in an SSAE 16 as well. But at the end of the day, an SSAE 16 really is, if we just simplify it right down, it's two things. Number one is what I'm doing reasonable, meaning is the things that I'm doing to protect my client's data or to provide accuracy and quality, are they reasonable? Number one. And then number two, am I doing what I say I do? That's fundamentally what an SSAE 16 is, allows your client to see. What are they doing, and do they do what they say they do? So there are two types. There's a type 1 and a type 2. A type 1 is a snapshot in time. So we don't look backwards over time. How have you been doing this? We just look at today and say, are these things in place or not? Yes or no. SSAE 16 type 2, however, looks at a period of time, generally at least 6 months, but not more than a year. So in the case of a type 1, for instance, let's take the example of a new employee background check, which would be a common control. So in the case of a type 1, we want to know that you're doing it. So we would look to see, do you have a policy? Yes. Does the HR person, can they, during an interview, articulate what the process is? Yes. Have they ever performed a background check? Yes. Okay. This control is in place. That'd be a type 1. In the case of a type 2, we would say, how many people did you hire in the last 6 months? And if you told us 4, we would want to look at 4 background checks. So it's the same control, it's just the type 2 looks more deeply, and the type 1 is a more shallow test. It's an easier test to pass. Most companies start with a type 1 and then move to a type 2 in the future, you know, at step 2. It's kind of the most common path. So a SOC 2 is a audit of specific principles. So unlike SSAE 16, which is customized to your business, SOC 2 says, hey, we want to make sure this company is secure. So if you choose the security principle, and then there's a list of requirements that you have to meet. And SOC 2 has 5 principles to choose from. I can do security, I can do availability, meaning, you know, my systems can be depended on. That's generally, you're looking at things like backup, recovery, that kind of thing. Confidentiality, only the people who are supposed to be seeing this data do. Processing integrity is the quality we talked about earlier. And privacy, which is how do you protect consumer data. Privacy has to do with the relationship between you and the end consumer or the end patient. So it's typically not relevant to a service provider like a printer, because you would not have the relationship with the end consumer or patient. You would have a relationship with your client. They have the relationship with the consumer or patient. So privacy is typically not relevant in the printing industry. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Sarah. HIPAA audit. A HIPAA audit is a review of the physical safeguards, and when we say safeguards, that's the law says safeguards, but it's really the same thing we've been talking about. It's controls. What are the physical controls I have in place? What are the appropriate administrative safeguards? And what are the technical safeguards I have in place to protect specifically protected health information? So it's very, very much like the SSAE 16, only it's focused on healthcare data specifically. So a PCI audit would be an audit of the approximately 212 controls. There's 6 control objectives, there's 12 subject areas, but it totals up to about 212 controls that are in place to protect credit card data. So it's a pretty detailed, pretty involved audit involving how you protect credit card data. And PCI audit is very checklist, it's very checklist oriented. The technical people would call it binary, right? It's yes or no. I'm either compliant, it's in place, or no, it's not, and you're not compliant. So it's a very specific type audit. There's the 12 for you that are gonna, you will, by the way, I know Sarah said if you had any questions, feel free to use the chat window or the Q&A window. We'll gather those questions. But one of the questions we usually get asked is, will we be sending the presentation out? And yes, we absolutely will. And so just want you to know you'll have this slide, but these are the 6 control objectives on the left and the 12 general requirements on the right. And within those 12 requirements, there's a total of roughly 212 actual requirements. So some of which may not apply, by the way, but if you have more questions about that, you can reach out. A FSMA audit is a thorough assessment of your information security practices as it relates to NIST 800-53 requirements. Again, it's probably the most comprehensive audit on the list. If you want to work with the federal government, you are going to have a high level of information security, and feel more about that if you have questions about it. So a little bit about why us, why you might talk to us about helping you with any of these things. We do have a tremendous amount of industry experience in the printing industry. We have quite a number of printing industry clients, As a CPA, we don't do financial auditing. We don't do tax-related consulting, for instance. That's all we do as a CPA firm. So we perform hundreds of these audits. We're very good at, therefore, at helping clients prepare, know what to do, providing guidance. We're not like your typical CPA, which doesn't really do very much of this at all, if they do at all, and would have very little experience in order to guide you. We perform hundreds of these every year. So we do use an online methodology which streamlines the process. And a big reason our clients use us is because we can perform all of these any of these audits at one time. So as you might imagine, as you listened, PCI has a lot of requirements that overlap with HIPAA, which overlap with SOC 2 or overlap with SSAE 16, meaning there's a lot of duplication there. So it's very cost effective to do, if you need more than one audit, to do them at the same time. That way we're not testing the same thing over and over again. So it does allow you to get a cost-effective solution for getting multiple audits done at one time. And probably one of the most common reasons for the printing industry is that we have significantly pre-negotiated discounted pricing through the affiliate for the members. So that would also be a big reason why those in the printing industry work with us. So this is just going to throw up my contact information here. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have regarding any of these audit formats, or even specifics there within the audit formats. Be happy to do that. So feel free to jot that down. Again, you'll be getting this presentation as a follow-up email. There'll be a link to download this presentation for reference, and you'll have my contact information there if we can be of any assistance. So I know, Sarah, we've gotten several good questions in the past when we've done this, and so it might be worthwhile just for me to go ahead and kind of jump into to a couple of those. Probably one of the more pertinent questions was, what are my risks? One of the printing organization asked, what are the risks if I don't get a HIPAA audit, for instance, or I don't get an SSAE 16 audit? And in the case of the SSAE 16 audit, the risk is just business revenue risk, right? There's certain entities that you just will not be able to do business with unless you have them. Financial institutions are going to be one of the biggest ones. So, there are certain publicly traded entities, local, state, that would not have the opportunity to get that business if I didn't have that audit. And so that's kind of the risk there. On the HIPAA side, however, 2013, the omnibus rule was established, which requires business associates not only to be compliant, but it allows the Department of Health and Human Services to audit and fine the business associate directly for any kind of healthcare breach. So in the past, Health and Human Services would sanction the covered entity, and it would be the covered entity's job to pursue civil liability with the business associate. So if I was a printer and I had a data breach for a healthcare provider, the healthcare provider would be in trouble, if you will, quote unquote, with the government, but the healthcare provider would have to come after me. Well, in September 2013, the law was updated, the omnibus rule was issued, which allows the federal government to directly audit, directly fine, sanction, et cetera, do enforcement action on the business associate. So in the case of HIPAA, if there's a healthcare breach, you are directly liable. And no longer the government can, if they determine that the covered entity did their due diligence, but you didn't, the healthcare entity would not be fined at all. It would just be you. So you have a high amount of liability in terms of healthcare data. So that's probably the greatest liability. So that was a really good question that we had that I thought would be helpful to share. Sarah, are there any other questions that we've gotten or would be good for me to ask here at the end, or sorry, answer here at the end?
We haven't received any additional questions today. I can't think of any others that you haven't already addressed that we most typically get in the past.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, I know one just popped into my head was how long does it take? I would say a typical, probably the most common commonly pursued audits are the SSAE 16 Type 1 or a SOC 2 Type 1 or the HIPAA audit. Those three would be the most common for a print provider. And typically, if you're pursuing the Type 1 or a HIPAA audit, it's typically a 90-day process. Typically you're going to spend 60 days sort of learning what you need to know, and you're going to write policies and procedures and kind of get things in place. And typically we're spending about 30 days worth of audit and report writing. We'll audit and then spend a few weeks writing the report, to be more specific. So 90 days, maybe 120 days is kind of a normal time frame. So if you have a business requirement or a client requirement, you can kind of project out, 90 to 120 days is probably the time I need. Time frame question, I know, is a common question that I get.
We did get a question about the general cost of the audit.
Yeah, so reach out to your printing affiliate. They have the pre-negotiated pricing that we've provided them, so they would be the best source for that. There's about a 25% discount. And I would say Kirkpatrick Price, because we are a specialized firm that does this and we use an online methodology, we're typically among the audit firms out there. There's a wide range of pricing, obviously. If you called Pricewaterhouse before, you'd be on the high end of the price structure, and there's kind of the low end. We tend to be on the lower end of the spectrum in the first place, and then we have the discounted pricing. So just reach out to your affiliate, and they'll have it. Or if you send me an email, I can connect you with the account manager who the affiliate, and they can get you that more specific pricing. So I will say that there's the discounted pricing on the standard engagement, but there's also combined pricing. When you do two at one time, there's a further discount because of the cost savings of doing them together. So I just encourage you to reach out. Quick email to your affiliate, and you can kind of get some pricing. So any questions, Sarah?
No, that's it.
Great. Well, thank you again for attending, and feel free to reach out to us. Thank you. Want to thank the Printing Association there in San Diego. Appreciate the opportunity to work with you guys and partner with you as well. So I just want to thank you for for the relationship and the opportunity to talk to some of your members today. So have a great afternoon.